I care a lot about being able to trust institutions, that there are checks and balances, that when somebody is accused of corruption, they go to something like a corruption commission. When a government department is starting to stray and spray money that it shouldn't be, then someone like the Ombudsman will release reports. I care that upper house or Senate inquiries can be set up into issues where people have to give evidence, do so before camera, that sometimes governments don't want. And I also want a system where the media in this country, if they are aware of something going wrong, is able to use a system that compels a government to show us the detail of what they are doing wrong. Now, there is not a government in our history that does not try to slow many of these processes. But the difference between a first and a third world country is restraint. In terms of open and effective government, one of the worst in our history is the current Labor government in Victoria. Second to that was the former Labor Queensland government. But the lessons that have been learnt out of those two governments about how to squeeze opposition, own the public service, and deny the public information about their malfeasance is almost second to none. Now, I often talk about the Prime Minister having a bet each way, to being each way elbow. Why? Because, again, says one thing, does another. As Chris Kenny beautifully exposed tonight, he had plenty to say about people being sent to Nauru when he was the rousing lefty opposition MP. Now he's the Prime Minister and he wants to get a problem out of the way. He's more than happy sending people to Nauru. That's the example of the each way elbow. Tonight, the example, though, is that towards the end of the Morrison government, the obsessive ramble of the left that was said by the politicians, reinforced by the media, and then eventually believed by Australians, was that, of course, the former government was so off the tracks when it came to transparency. A point so much so that it was made over and over again by his truly.
We need more transparency, not less. Well, there's a need for transparency on these issues and the public are entitled to it. National Integrity Commission to be put in place so that people can have confidence in the transparency and the integrity of our political processes.
Now, process can often be quite boring. Process doesn't excite the extreme numbers of people as, say, a rugby league player drinking out of a toilet. Yeah, that actually happened. And I was listening to the breakfast radio today, and normally at 7:10, the main thing they're talking about, no fewer than 4 breakfast radio stations, AM and FM, all at the exact same time talking about the same thing, which was a footballer drinking out of a toilet. Okay, I get it. Interesting, but doesn't really change anyone's life. But when the government finds new ways to stop you and I from knowing what's really going on, it is a bigger story. It's not as sexy, it's not as interesting, it's not as funny, but it matters. All of that build-up leads to this. Today, the Attorney-General, Michelle Rowland, remember the one who, along with the Prime Minister, wanted to censor the internet? Well, these people who demanded more open and more transparent government are now finding a new way to make it harder for anyone to find out what is actually going on behind the scenes. I will take from multiple sources, but this one from the ABC. Labor plans freedom of information changes to make it harder to access government data. Attorney-General Michelle Rowland will introduce legislation on Wednesday that would make it harder for journalists and members of the public to gain access to documents related to deliberations. It would also clarify the rules when documents could be deemed confidential because they related to cabinet process, an avenue that the Robodebt Royal Commission found was routinely abused by public servants as an excuse to refuse freedom of information requests. The details of this clarification are yet to be known, but the ABC understands that the change may lead to more documents being labelled as cabinet confidential, not fewer. Now, why does this matter? because one of the few areas we have to know what the government doesn't want to package up and release when they want to is the freedom of information system. By being able to give more members of the public service, more members of the parliament, more members of the federal cabinet an ability to computer says no, redact or just never show you what's happening behind the scenes is bad for our democracy. So despite all of the protestations about a new broom and a new way of doing things, the more time that this government spends in power with more seats and more power, it continues to display what is very effective politically, but absolutely appalling for transparency, which is the Daniel Andrews model of the Victorian Labor Party and the Victorian government, where the public service is virtually indivisible from wanting to protect the political master, because the political master is so successful at being able to hide what's really going on. And because of the triangle of dependency, nobody rocks the boat, and the free and open society gets tighter and tighter. On top of these changes, which again, I don't expect to be barbecue stoppers around the country, but of course is a great difference from what was promised. But so much is different than what was promised. And isn't it amazing that when the media like the side of politics, that are the ones that are welding the doors shut, putting up the curtains to make sure no sunlight gets in, they don't care about process. But if it was a political party they don't agree with, then of course it's all process all the time. Where is the daily conversations around such transparency from the independents or the Greens? Or in between rants, Jackie Lambie? Of course it won't happen because they like the boat that's currently in the water and they have no plans to rock it. Now, on top of all of this, it is now going to be more expensive for members of the public or journalists to be able to file a freedom of information request. So one of the disincentives about the government having to even expose what it doesn't want to expose is that it costs money to even ask a question of which, to use rugby league parlance, they may slow play the ball or they may simply ignore. And those prices are about to be increased. Tim Wilson makes a good point on this today in Canberra.
Well, I mean, this is clearly the Albanese curtain of secrecy is descending on Canberra. They're trying to impose a truth tax on people being able to access basic information from government. The argument being put forward that it's being dealt with to address bots is ridiculous. Software platforms deal with this every day when they have a little box where you tick it and they put up a little code, so you have to enter it in to make sure that you're not being used by a bot. Surely the Commonwealth of Australia can figure this out.
Yeah, the apparent defence for all of this is that AI is going to be doing rubbish. It's just a party with 94 seats, the media in tow, and very few people interested in scandalising the process. That means the process changes before our very eyes. Now, interestingly, this is another tactic which has been used by this government, where we have seen in its first term hundreds and hundreds of questions that were taken on notice because they were either too sharp or they knew the detail was something they didn't want to be made public through the Senate estimates process. Well, that's one of the ways they've shut down information. It's why they will plan to do so into the future. And don't forget, this is a government that gets people to sign non-disclosure agreements while they are in the room talking with government about what legislation may or may not be passed. Because you see, this government has a pretty simple principle. If nobody knows how the sausage is made, then when the sausage is served to the Australian people, you can tell them that something's full of sawdust, or you can tell them that it's a bratwurst. Either way, there is no paper trail. There is no evidence to tell us what the actual ingredient of the sausage is. And when it comes to the transparency of this government, it stinks. And I could be a Lone Ranger who cares about it, but I reckon you do too. I could be a Lone Ranger who wants to lead their show with it, but I think it matters. Can you know what you think? send me an email, paul@skynews.com.au. Now, to the matters to do with mass migration, ones that we have been talking about for the entire time we have been on air here, 15 years and counting here on Sky News. As always, I thank you for your support. Labor's made the decision, no change in the next 12 months from the previous 12 months, the amount of people that are coming into the country. The number of migrants granted permanent residency in Australia will not change this financial year. The federal government has announced a total of 185,000 permanent visas will be available in 25-26, split among skilled workers and family of current residents, meaning unskilled people, who will be being added to all of the other queues. Now, as you can see with this document here, yes, the numbers are ever so slightly coming down from the record highs of migration and net migration, which is the yellow line to pay attention to there. And it is coming down from those record highs, of course, after the borders were reopened and this government first came to power. But one of the reasons why people have a frustration about this issue, one of the reasons why people do get peed off, is because this latest number that is being put before us of 185,000 works like inflation, because when you put it on top of 184,000 to the year of June 2015, add it to the 206,000, the 263,000, the 238, the 241, the 192, minus that by 84,000 who left the country, then 203,000, 535,000 and 445,000, you start to see the picture. That the government wants to make it seem like the only number we're talking about is 185,000. And there are people, and there are plenty of versions of this article that exist on lots of media websites pushing back about the events of the weekend, including Australians took to the streets because they are scared by numbers that don't exist. But the reality of Australians who have their issues with the size of the Australian population and what we get out of and in exchange for the size of population is what matters. These are numbers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, not a far right-wing think tank and certainly not taken out of context. Australia's population 30 years ago was 18 million people. We are now up by 50% on that number in 30 years to 27 million. If immigration remains high, we're going to be at more than 40 million people in the next 3 years' time. Even if that number is ever so slightly down, it's still going to be in the very, very high, like 39 million. That's the reality of what I think drives much frustration. Now, it is too easy for the people who have wanted to talk about ethnicity as their reason for frustration, of which I disagree. But also those who want to say, nothing to see here, when the reality is that our population has changed that dramatically in the space of the majority of voters' lives. Now remember, 50% of the electorate is over the age of 50. Well, of course, the number goes way higher than half once we go back to, say, people over the age of 30. In their lifetime, the population of the country has changed. The demand on services has changed. The number of people who have to pay for the privilege of using a tollway to squint because the sun is coming up as they go to work and squint as the sun is going down when they come home from work to spend less time with their kids is part of this whole mix. I'm going to talk about this, again, in an adult conversation that I know you can cop and I think you will be very interested in. Kos Samaras is a man who knows it all because he understands what the politics of this is, because for his entire career he has been talking to voters and looking at data, and he's made some very interesting observations, particularly about Indian voters, who culturally you would think would be voting Liberal, but he'll explain why they keep voting for Labor. We'll get to him in a second. Now, a couple of other things here. As you know, last week, plenty of people protesting about the steamroller effect of brand new renewable projects being rolled out in and around places like Victoria, regional Victoria in particular. And people are, when given the opportunity, absolutely red hot on the attitude, which is the steamroller, that you're going to cop them. And even if they're not on your house, the power lines that connect other people's properties will still go over your property.
This is all about all Victorians, because every Victorian is going to get hit worse and worse every year.
Anonymous messages being put on people's cars because they're saying, no, we don't want transmission lines and mines and turbines around, and it's just not on.
There's the lunatics. There are lunatics in Australia and they're running our bloody country. And Tony Albanese needs to go.
Well, as you may have heard already tonight, Chris Bowen's response is, who cares? Chris Bowen's belief is the federal election has given him the full political and moral authority to power on with a system that, remember, is about fixing 1% of global emissions. And even then, all of the changes when it comes to the energy system will not even achieve what they are hoping to be, a dent in 1% of the world's problems. In an interview with the Australian newspaper, Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen says some opponents of wind and solar projects live hundreds of kilometres from developments and are driven by climate change denial and anti-renewables disinformation. As he declares, ambitious climate action over the next decade will be key to determining whether we are a prosperous country or not. Put simply, without all of these changes, then somehow we're going to go backwards, despite the fact that we're going backwards with all of these changes. Mr Bowen said it was important to separate the signal of genuine community concern from the noise propagated by anti-renewable campaigners who ramped up their opposition to projects because they did not believe in taking action on climate change. He notes Labor MP Meryl Swanson won her seat at Patterson. This was despite the fact that there was quite a campaign against an offshore wind farm. In fact, she ended up increasing her majority. I care very much about the signal where a community has a legitimate concern that needs to be worked through. They got my full attention. Whereas noise, where the climate change denial, anti-renewables disinformation, I accept that's a reality, but I don't accept that influences the policy. So put simply, agree with me, let's hold hands, disagree with me, get out of the way. Now, being a Tuesday, for many people, you were still working hard and you weren't working for yourself because the money that you were earning is going to go in tax by the end of the week. So how did those who represent us in the federal parliament spend today while you were working? While you were working, of course, they jump onto social media to make themselves look like $1 million, and they've got staffers to make them look like the influencers they wish to be. So while you were working, they were doing this.
This is really hard. Ooh. Oh, that's a Z, not an S. I did it the wrong way. Happy Left-Handers Day, everyone. Small part of the population that's left-handed. I feel sorry for you. This is extremely hard to do. But keep up the good work, guys, because you make it work.
The only thing lefty about me, the way I write, always have, always will. And these two, again, these people, they sit around the cabinet table.
Spinach is such a gross food.
Mind a bit of spinach, I have to tell you the truth.
Really?
Aiming for that Popeye look, you know?
Murray, we're here at the Queen Vic Market. Queen Vic Market is so famous for so many different types of food. I think the Borak here is probably the most iconic, but I'm just going to challenge you to see if this is not the most beautiful Borak.
Okay, I will give it a go.
How good is this? Oh
Beautiful.
My God. Oh my God. I'm so excited.
That jam is amazing.
Yeah.
Dear God. From people who just take up space to a bloke who knows what he's talking about, Kosamaris with Redbridge. We spoke to them all the way through the election process. He's, of course, got a great history with the Labor Party, and I really want to point you to his podcast too, the Curtin podcast, which is from Curtin University, and it is a fascinating conversation. They've had former Liberal MPs, and they have some pretty direct chats. He even occasionally defends Sky News when all of the lefties on his podcast are trying to throw us under the bus. Cos, nice to talk to you, mate. So obviously immigration, it has long been in the news. It has long been part of the Australian conversation. But we know at this moment, for obvious reasons, there's a certain frustration. Reality is that I believe that the residual for those that are annoyed is not about ethnicity, it's about the sheer number of. It's about, as I showed before, a change in Australia's population going from 18 to 28 on its way to 40 million, where the infrastructure hasn't quite caught up. So in your conversations about immigration at a political level, how much of it is completely blank to ethnicity and how much of it is about ethnicity?
Bit of a mixed bag. So if we speak to most Australians and we ask them the question, do you think there's too much immigration? The answer is overwhelmingly going to be, yeah, I reckon so, even amongst diverse Australians. However, then when we ask them the question, so why do you think people are raising this as a concern right now? Some Australians will say, well, you know, I'm stuck in traffic for 2-3 hours a day. Our roads can't cope. And these are really, really legitimate reasons, especially in the outer suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne in particular, but also other cities. Then, of course, some diverse Australians have a view that, no, they're raising it right now because, well, they actually don't like us. And it's fundamentally also the epicenter of some of the problems we're seeing, where we now have communities that are voting for particular political parties, not because of their ideological perspective or what they actually personally believe in, but purely on sectarian grounds.
Yeah, which brings me to an observation about the Indian community. Right now, again, broad brushes here. Nobody's trying to be offensive. We're just trying to, from 1,000 miles up, have a look at what's going on here. Now, obviously, hardworking, entrepreneurial, socially conservative. You would think, okay, that's going to lean you in the direction of the Liberal Party. Yet, according to some of the analysis here, 85% of that diaspora voted for the Labor Party, which in many ways is antithetical to some of those things. So when you were talking to Indian voters or Australians of Indian descent, either people who'd just been here or been here for a little while, why did they vote Labor when presumably so many of the other things they're about and that they believe in line up the opposite of Labor?
Yeah, you've summed them up pretty well. They are largely small business people. They're entrepreneurial, wealth accumulators, very, very, very conservative in a lot of their social views. There's a good reason John Howard really embraced not just the Indian diaspora, but also the Chinese diaspora, and to bring them into this country in very significant numbers as skilled migrants. And that's because not only were that was going to be good for the economy, but also for him, you know, from his political perspective, would have been good politics too. But he didn't factor in that, unfortunately, for the Liberal Party, as time went on and he left the political scene, they got a bit careless with their language. And so a lot of these particularly younger Indian Australians, when we speak to them, they explain to us all these values that we just touched on. And we ask them the question, well, you should be voting Liberal. Why aren't you voting Liberal? And they say, well, because they don't like us.
Wow.
It's as simple as that.
So what is it about anything the Liberal Party has said that would give them that perception? Because obviously we certainly know, and again, we can have an hour-long conversation about information and misinformation in and around parts of the Australian Chinese media that makes its way through to the diaspora. But in terms of, there hasn't been the national security conversations, there hasn't been the COVID-esque issues. So what is the perception? Who is the figure? Is there a moment in time when something was said?
Yeah, I would say the best way, I think the damage that was done would have been during the Morrison years in particular.
Right.
And unfortunately for Peter Dutton, he was carrying that baggage as well. And some of the policy announcements he made just compounded that problem. And of course, Labor jumped on it and actually capitalised on it as well. Because you want to remember, back in 2016, I would argue that a very significant number of Chinese Australians voted for the Liberal Party.
Absolutely.
They won seats like Chisholm. You know, this constituency was not a Labor constituency, and now it's the exact opposite. And as a result of that, we're seeing seats like Menzies, Aston in Melbourne, Reid and Bennelong in Sydney go to the Labor Party purely because there's a very significant numbers of these people in these electorates. That said, it should also be listened to everyone in politics, and that is nothing is fixed.
Correct.
So my point is, if you're on the conservative side of politics, there's no point trying to basically say, well, that's it, wash our hands of them, they're never going to be with us again. Well, you don't know that, right? I mean, I'm born to Greek migrants. My parents voted Labor, and probably most Greeks of their generation at the time were 85% voting Labor. I can guarantee you the majority of Greeks from my generation today, they're voting Liberal.
Yeah.
Right?
And I reckon your gun and badge would be burnt if that was the case for you. But I understand. What you're saying about the broader diaspora. So, final question here. Okay, how important is it for everyone watching right now, who may well have felt more comfortable in 1995 than 2025 about, say, the size of population. Let's put all the other issues to a side, right? Everyone needs to learn that if you want any plan of winning 76 seats,
yes,
you have to have an ability not just to patronise, speak to, speak down to, turn up to the ethnic festivals. You can't get a majority of seats unless you are appealing to multiple diasporas. And how important is that for a message for Labor to hold on to, but again, more importantly for the coalition when it is trying to work out the next 3, the next 6, the next 9, the next 12 years?
Absolutely critical, and, we've done some work with the Daily Telegraph, for example, in this space, and they, at the beginning of the cricket season last year, they front-paged their narrative in Hindi. And rejoicing that the Indian cricket team was over here. The advertisements on the paper were in Indian language as well, and so that's the corporate world's moving in that direction, understanding this is a very significant group of Australians, big market share, and of course a big share of the ballot box. And I would say that at the moment they're voting Labor, but that's not fixed, and so. My message to people in politics, whether you're red or blue or green or whatever you are, don't assume things stay as they do. And hence I use the reference to the community I come from, where historically, we will march out to the polling place, with our dragged by our ear to vote for the Labor Party, right? But most of them are not doing that anymore. So.
Cos, it was state of the race in the lead up to the election. This might just be, the hard truths that we have to discuss for the next little while. Again, Redbridge, I think they're the best in the business. Thank you so much for your time, Cos. Talk to you soon. And again, the podcast, it is The Curtin Podcast, correct? Yep, that's the one. Yep. The Curtin Podcast. Go and find that. Really interesting stuff.